assume a lot of you enjoyed the feast, and I know that sometimes after a good feast you just want to go take a nap, so I appreciate that you're here to listen in on this next session. My name is Travis Kraus. I am in the Office of Outreach and Engagement, and my title is the Director of Economic Development and Sustainability. And without taking up too much time, I just want to say a couple of things before we bring up our first speaker. First of all, I just want to say that this is my first Grant Wood Art Symposium, and it's been very important and powerful to have these conversations that we've heard in the first couple of sessions, and I look forward to having those inform what we're going to talk about for our final round of panelists here. And the second thing is that I think we're transitioning back maybe where we started to this idea of place and how public art impacts place and is a component of placemaking, a word that we heard earlier. For me and probably for many of you, this is conference season, and we ended a conference yesterday that was a group, a congregation of economic development professionals from across the state of Iowa. And if you're not familiar with what that industry is like, it kind of traditionally was about chasing, well, they're really concerned about a couple of things. They still are, jobs and increasing the tax base, right? So that's pretty much what economic developers aim to accomplish. But the way that they do it has changed slightly. So in the past, economic development was about smokestack chasing. So trying to get those big, large industrial employers to your town that bring hundreds or thousands of jobs. And that's not really what economic developers do now, because that model has not worked. When companies leave and you've hung your hat on having one large employer, then that can have very detrimental effects on your community. So now economic developers are not only concerned about jobs and tax base, but we are concerned about creative placemaking and attaching residents and businesses to the community. And one thing that we are hearing increasingly is the role of arts and culture. And because of the way that we work with communities, I see a lot of requests for art projects. And we're really thrilled to have artists and our faculty members that are willing to partner with us. So the work that we do is bringing the resources from the University of Iowa into those communities. And I'm really excited when that involves MFA students and art faculty and cinema students. What we're going to hear about today is how art and public art specifically define that sense of place and play a role in spurring development as a catalyst for future activities. And so without further ado, I do want to read a quick biography for our first speaker, Michael LeClere. He is an architect and landscape architect from Martin Gardner Architecture in Marion, Iowa, and a native Iowan from Coggan. I think that his statement here is actually a good way to start this conversation. I just want to read it really quickly. Michael LeClere's professional focus revolves around the belief that communities are our greatest resources. Whether large or small, they tell the stories of who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. They exist and thrive because they've been loved, invested in, and stewarded. Public spaces serve as our best outdoor classrooms for understanding the application of the arts, science, engineering, and economics. Just as individuals have a right to education, communities have a right to tools, resources, and strategies to sustain themselves. Communities deserve good classrooms that encourage interaction and critical thinking. They deserve good planning and design despite their size or the obstacles they face. So, welcome, Michael.
Thank you, guys. Is that on? I'm going to try and walk around and walk off the meal here. But thank you for coming. Today I'd like to talk about art in public as well as the public realm and how that relationship affects human health, ecosystem quality, resource depletion, and economic development. I figure this is a good place to start, being the Grant Wood Symposium, one of the most recognized pieces of art in the nation as well as beyond. And you don't have to go very far to see its influence on culture. These are my grandparents. My grandpa just celebrated his 90th birthday, and so it has far-reaching influences in large and small ways. When you Google art in public, these are the first 4 images that come up. I think their range is very telling, as well as how it's, oops, I just shut that off. Oops. As well as how it's defined. What I am struggling with as a professional is how this can be considered art, but this is considered architecture or landscape architecture. I don't necessarily believe there's much of a difference, but I should note, not everyone agrees. I'm not going to get into the weeds today, but I think we can dive in here with a contemporary of Grant Wood's and just understand how culture can't happen without art and art can't happen without culture. And that relationship influences us at a very, very early age. I think seeing these two side by side can speak volumes. Perhaps the best people to speak to the role of place-specific design are both the native populations that first inhabited this land as well as the homesteaders, both of which followed a very prescriptive set of principles to make life habitable here. Evergreens create your wind block. Deciduous trees create shade in summer, etc. And I'm going to jump to a personal example here where I try to take that approach when looking at a place and analyzing how it feels and what it means as the basis of design. Go back here quick. And that can be scaled up or down. I think it's very easy to see. We have buggy space, even back in the area, pedestrian space, water, and culture all interacting together. Or even in New York, where here you see a public park, space for cars and horses, and the public way. Basically, we're talking about community planning, also known as creative placemaking, or it could be summed up just as art as design. This afternoon, our keynote speaker will speak a little more to that subject, so we look forward to that. But I want to start with how I became interested in this subject and walk you through some examples of my work and the work of our firm, as well as precedents that have inspired and informed me along the way. This is me and my 3 brothers on our Century Family Farm just in northern Lynn County. And throughout my lifetime, this has become a very familiar scene. Declining population, empty storefronts, and culture completely detached from a changing economy they've struggled to adapt to. If we look at the whole US population, it's kind of easy to understand why we're so politically divided right now. Half the freaking country is in decline, and they're in a boat without a paddle, not knowing where to go, not knowing what resources are available. And so we've been trying really hard to connect communities to those resources. In Iowa, it's even bleaker. All the red is decline, all the white is basically stagnation. As part of my graduate thesis, I looked at just Main Street buildings briefly and wanted to know what their impact was in terms of embodied energy. I looked just at communities under 1,000 and just at buildings, and their embodied energy, meaning all the costs to extract materials, build materials, labor, ended up being 138% greater than the BP oil spill. The problem is that doesn't include roads, doesn't include sewers, it doesn't include sidewalks, and it's actually communities 5,000 and up that are struggling with this. Once you get to around 10,000, you have more full-time government employees that can take on some of this projects. Otherwise, you're asking people working 40 hours a week and volunteering for their government to try and get grants that they have no experience with. So that's a big hurdle to some of these. Part of the problem, admittedly, is with us. This is probably what most people think of when they think of architects, high-minded men in suits imposing their vision on the world. Very terrible. Unfortunately, our more recent representation isn't much better. Black spectacles and scarves, and again, grand designs that really are devoid from culture and place. This is more what design and placemaking is about. Participatory design and community involvement, empowering people. So what we try to do is engage local artists when possible and make it an integral part of the design, not an afterthought. Preservation, giving new life to old buildings. I don't know why we let a building get 50, 100 years old and tear it down and take $1,000 vacations to Rome. We have history here, and it's equally as important to preserve. As well as engaging with nature and our natural environment, because they are codependent. We like to think of our work as economic development, not just architecture, not just landscape architecture, but the effects of the edge of the building to the middle of the street and what that does for business owners, how that brings people in the door, how that allows them to put displays in the windows and life on the streets. What we try and do is take buildings like this and work with communities with limited resources and do small contracts, just images that can accompany grant applications and get projects actually funded. No one can build off of this. This is just a quick illustration of what it can become or the intent of the project. Once a project's funded, we can go into construction documents and a contractor can actually build from that to bring new life to these places, to these main streets, and to these communities. Another volunteer organization I work with is Community Visioning out of ISU, an amazing program that targets communities under 10,000 and works with them basically on visioning material and helps them think what their community can become when they've walked past the same place years and years and only seen it decline. Then they have all of these resources to accompany grant applications and try and stand out amongst competitors. And even on small scales, it highlights and celebrates the culture and the economy that have kind of diverged because of the changing forces and means of agricultural production. I work with the Lynn County Historic Preservation Commission, and I don't have time to actually go into this, but we have an online portal where you can zoom in to any community in Lynn County. We're unique because we've had the whole county surveyed for our historic inventory and what is eligible to be nominated to the National Registry of Historic Places, and people can click and read the reports of specific properties or specific places in their communities to start engagement. We also work with the local ACE program, which it stands for Architecture, Construction, and Engineering, and introduces young high school kids to these career paths based on their interests, based on personality tests, and there's interviews of professionals there. I will admit I never thought I'd be in this profession when I was in high school. I wasn't even interested in it. I thought it was math, blueprints, nothing creative, and I was completely wrong, thank God. But let's start early, and let's engage the youth and teach them about stewardship. This is a monarch seed ball project we do and distribute throughout the town. So each of these are little seed bombs that support native pollinators and butterflies, and we put them in libraries and coffee shops. Oops, all this is fine. I like to say, let's use our utilities as amenities. Every downspout and every storm sewer inlet is a missed opportunity to introduce some native vegetation, liven up the streets, green the streets up, provide shade, and make it more attractive for businesses, make it more attractive for people to patron that area. That's how you create places of repose, places of connection, places that have meaning within our urban environments, whether large or whether small and simple, like the bike racks. I also want to talk about highlighting the assets that we have and not turning our back on them and thinking we need to bring something entirely new in. This is Gasworks Park in Seattle. This is still a factory at this time, but it was art that started this project after the factory closed and created great public space that kept their historic heritage and legacy intact to speak to this new urban environment. And it actually facilitates art, and just to make sure this wasn't some strange isolated incident in the 70s, I found this. So it continues to be a gathering space, it continues to be a branding opportunity, and it continues to be a dialogue with art and public space. Another example is Granville Island in Vancouver, BC. Again, an old factory that closed after World War II that has become a public market, a public space, and can still brag about having an operating cement plant in the area, driving in the same streets as pedestrians, but branded, highlighted, and defined through art and social interaction. I love when old and new meet together. It helps inform you where you came from, where you are today, and where you may be going in the future. Here's a couple examples of that where old grain silos become museums or almost cathedrals to history and culture. We have these opportunities all around us right now. It's just a matter of bringing disparate organizations together to facilitate big impacts. This is an example in Cedar Rapids, an icon everyone drives past almost every day, and a perfect blank canvas or opportunity for a mural. And again, those icons influence us at an early age. So let's highlight them because this place has fed many people throughout the nation, created economic opportunity for families. It's not just a factory we should turn our back to and say, this is not art and this is. I think those can exist together. This, I don't know if I'll play the whole thing, but this is an example on Blair's Ferry Road in Cedar Rapids where they tore down the Nash Finch site to put up a Gander Mountain that I think was open for 2 days before they went out of business, the whole organization, and some strip malls. But the important thing is, this might not be the answer for every opportunity, but this will never be built again. So we've lost an opportunity to connect to what it was and have pride in where we are today. This is what replaced it. You might say, Michael, this isn't fair, this isn't done yet, you can see them working, there's nothing planted. Okay, fine. I'll give you a break. Michael, it's still not fair, there's no business there yet. Okay, fine, we'll wait till the business is in. But the thing is, where is this and what does it respond to? Absolutely nothing. You can put it anywhere, period. I'm gonna take a little break and let this guy rant for a short bit because I think he's a little more articulate maybe than I am. But I think his point is very important.
Consequently, these will be places that nobody wants to be in. These will be places that are not worth caring about.
Let's get him big. Oh, there we are.
We have about 38,000 places that are not worth caring about in the United States today. When we have enough of them, we're going to have a nation that's not worth defending.
Sorry for the
When
quality.
you think about that, when you think about those young men and women who are over in places like Iraq, spilling their blood in the sand, and ask yourself, what is their last thought of home? I hope it's not the curb cut between the Chuck E. Cheese and the Target store, because that's not good enough for Americans.
I would probably say that's not good enough for anybody, but I can't agree with him more. I don't know if anyone remembers this from the 80s. I'm going to go ahead and play the commercial quickly for you, but I want to get a little scientific here and say why this is critically important and not just about pretty places. So I'm going to play this commercial to see if you remember it.
Only one drug is so addictive, 9 out of 10 laboratory rats will use it. And use it. And use it. Until dead.
The rat dies, if you didn't know. So that's an anti-cocaine commercial from the 80s. And basically what they did there was set up a cage, put a rat in it, have a water bottle, and have a water bottle laced with cocaine. The rat chooses the cocaine water, gets addicted, and dies. So another researcher was like, what about context? What about place? So he creates Rat Park, where there's other rats, there's plenty of space, there's toys, there's things to engage them, there's things to have a rat culture. Same 2 water bottles, the rats never touched the cocaine-laced water bottle the whole time. So I think these are his conclusions, but I think the implications for placemaking and art and meaningful places is apparent right there. We need places where we can bump into a neighbor and have a meaningful conversation, where we can see places that we want to go to. What better marketing for a business than to see people improving or enjoying your product right outside? It also deters crime, because there's eyes on the street and it's harder to get away with things, and you've created safer neighborhoods. You need places to pause and catch yourself off guard, places to reflect on where you are in time and where you are in culture, because that's how we create meaning. And it doesn't have to be expensive. It can be as simple as paint and palettes. And so there should be no barriers, whether it's an urban environment or a rural environment. In Marion here, they've taken an alley and transformed it into places for people, places to gather, places to celebrate art. And we were happy to make, very literally, a small contribution to this effort. And I'll just end with this little rendering we did. Developer was trying to liven up this part of the area, and this was an early schematic proposal. This was really all we did with the developer, but again, seeing how those lessons can be implemented anywhere and at any scale. And as that wraps up, that is it for me. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. That was a very effective use of cocaine rat to get your message across. So just to keep us moving along, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Desmond Lewis. Desmond Lewis is a sculptor that grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. He is currently the studio technician for the Department of Art and Design at Austin Peay State University. He received his Bachelor of Science from Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee, and his Associate of Arts from Bard College at Simon's Rock in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He graduated in May 2017 with a Master in Fine Arts in Sculpture from the University of Memphis. At the University of Memphis, he was the recipient of the Graduate Purchase Award from the 34th Annual Student Exhibition at the Art Museum of the University of Memphis, while additionally being the recipient of the Tom Stevens Scholarship, Haystack School of Crafts Minority Scholarship, and the River Art Scholarship. He was also named one of the 100 Interesting and Influential People of Memphis. His work has been exhibited in Missouri, Arkansas, Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, Vermont, South Dakota, and Massachusetts. His public work can be found at Penland School of Crafts, Carolina Bronze Sculpture Park, the city of Lenoir, North Carolina, the city of Hickory, North Carolina, Vermont Carving and Sculpture Center, the University of Memphis, Soulsville, USA, this is a long list, geez. Stax Museum of American Soul Music, and Orange Mound in Memphis, Tennessee. His studio is based in Memphis, Tennessee. So welcome, Desmond.
Thanks for that introduction. The only caveat is in June I left my position as a studio tech and became the visiting assistant professor of ceramics at Austin Peay. So, which has also been kind of a weird transition, trying to figure out how to keep making work and teach full time. So I started grad school when I was 20 years old, and I was trying to figure out like what I was doing. So I started trying to carry over ideas that I had with my work in undergrad, and then trying to make that in a different material in grad school. I have a ceramics background, and I wanted to try a different material. So this piece is called Revolution Rise. in this image, it's pictured in Lenore, North Carolina, but the city of Hickory bought the piece, and then for 2 years it sat in storage until last week when it was installed in its final location on a playground. My work during this time period dealt with trying to make the connotation between experiences of Eastern Europeans and African Americans, and drawing that relationship that during the color revolutions of like the early 2000s and the late 90s to experiences with police brutality protest. This piece is at the Vermont Carving and Sculpture Center. In thinking about the context of this piece now, I struggle with it. You'll notice at the bottom of the image, there's like a pipe that's connected to the piece, and that pipe goes down 600 feet into an old marble quarry, where 70% of Washington, D.C.'s marble came from. In thinking about the current political climate, I struggle with that. One of the more interesting things about my practice is that I work a lot with like local companies, and a lot of my work is paid for before it's even ever conceived, weirdly. So Vermont Studio and Carving Center, or Sculpture and Carving Center, brought me up for 3 days. They gave me all the material, and they gave me an outdoor tent to work in, and 3 days I built this piece. All the pipes are made out of old scaffolding, and all the chains are forged by me. That's actually channel steel, commonly used to hold up buildings. And those chains are about 2 feet in length, each one of them. So after the Vermont piece, I was kind of trying to figure out what I was doing. I was following the lineage of like Richard Hunt and Isaac Duncan and Gary Bibbs, because I knew that I wanted to make public art, and I thought that I just wanted to kind of be like what they were doing. But it really, at some point in grad school, it didn't feel right anymore, and I really had to like check myself in a way. And decided that I wasn't having fun anymore making these pieces. So I started really analyzing why I was making the work that I was making using steel as a material, because I can fabricate all day, but if the material doesn't have a meaning, then why am I doing this? So I started looking at steel and like really trying to understand like why I'm using steel and why am I attaching steel things to like concrete bases. I started looking at myself and my experience as an African American male in this country, but more specifically as an African American male in the South. And I started thinking about, why do I love working with this material? Why do I invest so much money in trying to work with this material? And I started thinking about my experience, and I make this connotation. It seems kind of strange, but if you look at how a building is built, you look at its concrete facade. And usually that concrete facade has like a whitish exterior, but you don't notice the steel rebar that's on the inside. Much like we don't take the time out to realize the contributions that African Americans have had in industrial America. But steel is also this amazing material that you can heat it, you can bend it, you can beat it, and it's still going to be really strong as a material. Much like African Americans have been heated, and yet we're still here. You can also leave steel outside and let it rust, and that kind of matches my skin tone. But also, African Americans and African American communities are sometimes left out to rust, and you just kind of wait till the next opportunity comes through. So this piece is called America's Forgotten, weighs 6,000 pounds, 16 feet tall. All the chains are hand forged by me. And what you can't see, that there's actually coal slag at the bottom of it. So right above the sand, there's actually coal slag. So I try to like hit major industrial materials that we commonly don't see in sculpture anymore. So as I was kind of also trying to figure out my life, I was looking at my public work from a different point, and wondering like, why do I keep feeding these communities that can afford my work? And I'm in Memphis, which is like a really poor, city, and what about these people that are around me? Why am I not interested in them? So an opportunity came my way in 2016 in Soulsville to construct this outdoor piece. And frankly, I had no experience in actually constructing something like this. I didn't know that I needed to rent a backhoe. I didn't know how to manage my budgets. I didn't know what it meant to have to break news to people that they can't have a platinum gold bench with a $3,000 budget. And sometimes negotiating with them took, it took a year and a half to negotiate that they can't have something that's platinum and gold. But they also, it was a wake-up call for me in terms of like, how do I price myself and what's the value of my time? So they allotted $3,000 for a project to build some benches, which I'll show you in a second. But they didn't allot for how the benches were going to be attached to the ground. And it so happened that this neighborhood for which the sculpture was going, you can buy a house for $3,000. So the crime rate, unfortunately, in that neighborhood is pretty high, and there's a high level of poverty. So they didn't account for the fact that I needed a concrete. Well, the benches needed a concrete base to be attached to. And I didn't know how much to charge them. So they're like, we can offer you $100. We have no more money in the budget. Me being the naive student that I was at the time, which is why I chose to do public art in grad school, accepted that $100, not realizing that that $100 didn't touch how much I would have to rent this little trackhoe for. Because the ground needed to be leveled and a whole bunch of other things. I also didn't really know, so I need to call a concrete truck in. And working in Memphis in the middle of July, when it's 98 degrees outside and 100% humidity, by myself, was a little challenging. So I poured these concrete pads, and that's the concrete truck guy who loved to pose for that picture. He's like, yeah, I'll take a picture for you. But you can see across the street that there's an In-N-Out grocery, and that's really like a transient spot. There's a lot of drug deals that happen there, a lot of crime that happens also at that corner. And this is the day that I installed these benches in this piece. This was a really life-changing moment for me, to be quite honest. I fabricated the benches by myself, and I painted them by myself, and then it was time for me to install them, so I unloaded them by myself, and these things are really heavy. They're 200 pounds a piece. For me, that's heavy by myself. So I was trying to manipulate them out of my vehicle, and then these two guys walked up, and I was like, great. I don't know if I should fear for my safety or if I should actually be accepting of their help. I was like, also, I don't have any money to pay them really, other than the $20 that's in my pocket, so I don't know what I'm going to do. So they walked up and they were like, we've been watching you for the last several weeks, and they would sit across the corner and drink all day because they had lost their jobs from the thrift store that burned down the street. And they said that we've been watching you, and we've been seeing you trying to change this corner where was laden with needles, laden with beer bottles, laden with beer cans, and we really want to, we see that you're trying to do something good for our community. And I was like, okay, well, if you can help me install these, and I don't know how I'll pay you back, but I'll pay you back somehow. So for the next couple of hours, they helped me drill holes. They wiped the benches off. They did all these amazing things, and then at the end of it, all they asked for was lunch money to be able to get something to eat. And that really changed how I looked at my practice, because when I didn't have anything and I was a broke grad student, these people were so generous enough to help me, and all they wanted was simply $20 to buy lunch, $10 for each of them. I don't remember their names, but I do know that they're still alive, because I go by this bench occasionally just to see if it's still there, and it's still there, and weirdly enough, no one sits on it. They still sit across the street drinking, but yet they keep the corner clean now. So whereas I was afraid that 2 years ago that this would be graffitied in the next day or so, they're still there, and they still actually clean them and sit there, and it's kind of nice. So another part of my MFA show was that I still wanted to do more benches. And I found these two kids at a local community center. I was like, you know, I need help. I don't like painting things because painting's horrible. I just not a fan. I like welding. I don't like painting. So I hired these two kids, and they came and painted for me. I paid them $20 an hour. And I picked them up from school, and after that, got them food, worked for me for 2 hours a day for a week, and then got them food on the way home. And they came from a family of 7. Their mom didn't work, and their father only worked part-time. And that budget for that project was only $2,000. So last August, the same organization that funded my Soulsville project also funded a bus stop down the street. So now I'm at a place in my career where I refuse to do a project if I can't hire somebody from the community. I won't do it. I've turned down projects recently that if I can't hire somebody, then we're not going to do it. So this is a bus stop. Actually, there's now a light added to it, so at nighttime it illuminates. But when I was installing this piece, I was measuring this bus stop. I was like, oh, well, this is random. And then this guy walked up and saw what I was doing and said, you know, is there any way that I can help you, or what are you putting here? And I said, well, there's a sculpture thing going here. He was like, oh, can I be involved? And I said, yeah, sure. Come back in a week at this time. So one of the weird things about my practice after I left grad school is that I live in Nashville. I teach at Austin Peay State University, which is an hour north of Nashville, but my studio is still in Memphis, which is 3.5 hours away from where I work. So every weekend for the last year, I've been commuting 3 hours every week. So I didn't think that this guy was going to show up. I was like, surely there's no reason to remember in a week. Well, he showed up with a polo, tucked in his pants, ready to work at the same exact time that I told him. And he didn't want to be paid initially, but I was like, you know, I'll give you something at least to get some food. Because he's the one who has to look at this piece every day, not me. And I only know him as T. I don't have a picture of T, but that's all I know him as by. So for the past couple of years, I've only been doing projects that are 5,000 and below. But last fall, I applied for an RFQ for this project in Orange Mound, which is the same place where the Mound Bench went, which is one of the oldest African American communities where African Americans could buy homes and build homes. So where these two arrows are, well, I got the RFQ, and then I was a finalist for the RFP, and then I got the project. It's a $65,000 project, and I'm going to build these. These are stainless steel benches with handprints from every student in the school, and they have a really nice dance program, so there are ballerinas there. So that's one part of the project. The other portion of the project are these monuments to the community, where there's a child in the first column, and then a teenager, adult, and elders. So I'm going to take images from people in the community and convert those images to silhouettes, and then plasma cut them out of stainless steel columns, and then illuminate them from the inside out. All with a budget of $65,000 and hiring 10 people from the community. So one of the weirder things about my practice is that a lot of my work is corporately sponsored. So how I get those corporate sponsorships is I literally will walk into the door of a corporation and be like, hey, this is what I'm doing. I need something from you. So this company, Wicked Good Charcoal, sent me 2 bags of charcoal, mailed them to Skowhegan School of Sculpture and Painting, where I was in June, July, and August. For me to have this community barbecue. So I built this barbecue grill in the shape of a boat, and then I gave it to the city of Skowhegan. Unfortunately, when I was building this was the first time that I have really seen an increase in steel, thanks to the steel tariffs. So this project cost 3 times more than what it should have. This is also the first project that I personally funded out of my pocket. I haven't looked at the receipts because I'm afraid to. But I was really dissatisfied with this project until it actually went to the community center, and a lady that was inside playing bingo came and asked for enough food to take home to her family because she couldn't afford to feed them. So she ended up leaving with 20 hot dogs and 2 plates full of zucchini, and I think some squash too. And these are a couple of other people from Skowhegan, Danielle Rosen, who I've collaborated with recently in terms of other food projects, and then Anish, who's from India. If you don't know anything about Skowhegan, people from all over the world come, and it's like emerging artist residency for 9 weeks. So this is my last slide, but these are all the companies that have sponsored me in the last 2 years. Some of these range from I don't know, Moody Town Gardens gave me 200 pounds of zucchini and squash, to New Balance gave me $5,000 worth of fabric. And West Memphis Steel, the donation that West Memphis Steel gave me is what changed my life. They gave me 5 tons of steel. When it came time to get out of grad school, the first thing I had to buy was a forklift in order to move out of grad school, which was kind of sad, but I bought a 1968 forklift from the backwoods of Mississippi. Yeah. And then recently, I've started doing other public art things that are really low budget. So like fireworks inside of my steel sculptures. And then also I recently bought a tractor, John Deere tractor. And my hope for that is to do another public piece next year, where I can farm 4 acres of cotton, which is really specific. Farm those 4 acres of cotton, gin the cotton, and then hire people from a low-income community in Memphis to be able to come and basically make jeans and then sell those jeans and then have the money go back into a nonprofit or something. Yeah, so that's what I do. Thanks.
Okay, for our next panel, we have 2 panelists, Dan Perry and Tom Stancliffe. Dan Perry's sculptures are composed in ways that imply a narrative to which the viewer becomes a witness, part of a scene, a moment suspended in time. Over the past 10 years, he has exhibited his sculptures across the United States in over 40 juried and group exhibitions, as well as 10 solo exhibitions. Notable venues include the Des Moines Art Center, Waterloo Center for the Arts, and the Spartanburg Art Museum. He has also exhibited large-scale sculptures in outdoor exhibitions across the country. Dan has also completed 7 large-scale public sculpture commissions. Most recently, he completed large-scale sculptures for the cities of Urbandale and Marion, respectively. Currently, Dan is the art studio technician and instructor at the University of Northern Iowa, and also leads the UNI Public Art Incubator while serving on several civic public art committees. Tom Stancliffe is the lead artist in charge of the PAI, the Public Art Incubator. He is a professor of arts at the University of Northern Iowa, and his professional involvement in public arts spans nearly 40 years, beginning in 1974 when he was a studio assistant to sculptor Gene Horvath. In the early 1980s, after completing his MFA degree in Northern Illinois University, he was the lead fabrication assistant to sculptor Bruce White, and by 1988, the focus of his own artwork shifted almost completely to large-scale public sculpture. To date, he has completed over 25 commissioned public works nationally and serves on multiple civic public art committees. Welcome, Dan and Tom.
Okay. Hi,
Hi.
I'm Dan. He's Tom.
Yeah.
If you weren't sure. 4 years of experience.
We've done this kind of talk a number of times in the last year, and so we just sort of make it up as we go along. So kind of bear with us. We have, what, this 175?
We have 175 slides. And we do this, since we do this off the cuff, it's a little different every time. So the first time you're seeing this is the first time anybody's seeing this.
Yeah, right. Apparently, we're going to look at some of our work first, just to get a context. So I've been doing large-scale work for a long time. The bio you read said 25. I think I counted recently, I've done about 35 public commissions. This one's relatively recent. I put some examples in here of things in Iowa. This is at Fort Dodge. This is the Cedar Rapids Airport. Some things some of you from around here may have seen before. What else is in there? You might have had to stop to pee at a rest area on Interstate 80. You may have seen this. Anyway, so I've done a lot of work over a period of time.
And kind of like Tom, I kind of came into public art unexpectedly. It wasn't something I planned necessarily. But over the last 10 years, I've gotten to do some commissions, and these are ones again from Iowa. This is over here in Coralville as part of the Iowa River Landing. Up in Marion, Iowa, in the Art for the Alleyways, which was mentioned a little earlier, on UNI's campus, down in Urbandale, which is a suburb of Des Moines, that lights up. There's an actual size me, I think. So anyway, through all that, and Tom's long experience in this and my experience in this, we've realized that it takes a lot to get a public art project going, as many of you may know. And being on the academic side of things and also on the artist side of things, but as well, we volunteer in the community serving on public art committees that seek out and place artwork. So through that, we realized that we're contributing to these things in multiple ways, and we're kind of centered out of this university, this hub. So from that, and a lot of our students get to see this presentation in this way because we're trying to ingrain in them that, whatever they do, they should be able to leave college and be able to make a mark on the world somehow. So we talked to them about what defines a place, and it was really,
Right,
perfect.
exactly.
Spitballs, so where's this? I think it's like Buffalo, New York.
Yeah.
Where's this? It could be,
It's really funny when you show this, because everybody's convinced whatever town we're showing this in, if we've done this, they're convinced that it's their
you,
town.
yeah.
Oh yeah, that's the blah, 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 it's the mall. And
Yeah.
this is actually, I think, Buffalo, New York, isn't it?
Yeah, something like that, and then,
Yeah.
but then you start thinking about, like, when you see Egypt, what do you think of,
What's the image in your head,
right? What about Paris? Although those are becoming more prolific in our state especially. We like to think about these things that get put out into space and start identifying a space, and usually these things are panned, especially like the Eiffel Tower, for example. It was not a popular thing when it went up.
No,
Now you
no.
can't imagine France, or anybody talking about France, or maybe Las Vegas without it. Same thing like St. Louis.
Right. I mean, St. Louis is a fairly suffering economically community, and it's not that this by itself, building this colossal arch in the 1960s doesn't by itself change the economic conditions of St. Louis, but it effectively rebranded the identity of the town. I mean, it's this amazing thing, right, that doesn't do anything other than carry this bold sort of symbolic content. It has no other function to it, but it realigned the community.
Yeah, but it also becomes these things that get out there and they exist. They also become backdrops to whatever's happening to us culturally. So it's documented in imagery like this. I mean, I think this is a pretty recent image. And so the idea that these things become backdrops, marking time, marking history, but they're the one constant. Chicago. Right?
What do you guys do? Do you think about the bean? Is
Yeah.
that kind of the
Sorry, I
image in
was
most of
on
your
the
heads? Yeah.
Does anybody know the actual title of the artwork? Well, okay, good, right, we're at an art school.
Who's the artist? Yay!
But I would venture to say 90% of those people that attend this walk up to it without knowing any of that. And it doesn't matter, because this thing serves no other function than just existing there. This is a little harder.
What are you thinking about? What's in your head?
Okay, good, good.
Yeah.
The highway system.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It is a nice highway system
Yeah,
usually.
yeah.
But we chose this. Now, yeah, it's very controversial in some ways, but it's also like what we've talked about is maybe one of the first comprehensive public art projects as we know today, because it involved an artist, it involved government bodies, it involved employing several people to work on it. It took a long time, lots of money. In fact, I think it was stopped multiple times, but it was this thing also that this sort of vision, like I'm gonna go carve some faces on a giant rock. Convincing somebody in Washington that that's a good idea is harder. And of course, you know, like you say, what's the president's, but I'm sure like there was politicians at the time that were saying, well, why isn't my face going on there? But
It's also in the middle of nowhere,
Yeah.
you know, it becomes this place, you know. I mean, how many of you have seen it? How many of you have been there? See, most everybody's been there. And it's not just on the way to anywhere, you know, you have to intentionally go to it, you know. And so I think about that kind of thing a lot. I think about the sort of the idea, and there was some quote that from Christo, I believe, where he's talking about he was interested in the, and I'm paraphrasing terribly, but you know, interested in the artist's impact on the environment. And I was thinking about, or on the landscape, excuse me, not the environment. That's got too many other connotations. But you know, I was thinking about all the things that he goes through, all of the permissions and negotiations and things that go into the creating of his work isn't unlike anything else. It's like every other public art project in most ways. And I'm thinking about that idea. And so one of the things that I think Dan and I both kind of focus on a lot is and through the Public Art Incubator and our other activities and things is to find ways that the artists can insert their vision in the world in a sort of an enduring way. So.
yeah, so like contributing to the built environment is what we talk a lot about. Des Moines, people from Iowa you probably recognize, we talked about it a little bit today. It's something that before Des Moines didn't really have a specific landmark, but you have this now. You can't really see a postcard from Des Moines without this, maybe an ear of corn somewhere, unfortunately. But it's also interesting, we talked about this being kind of juxtaposed by the principal building, which is also the tallest building in Des Moines and probably the tallest structure for quite a ways around it being in Iowa. And it's also full of artwork.
Right, it's got one of the biggest art collections in the state, or the biggest.
So one of the things we talk about with this is these things get out there in the public, they're panned or accepted, but they start taking on their own identity. And Tom can talk a little bit more about this, but when we talk about the otherness of public art, like what happens when it's in the public realm?
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, thinking about things, and a lot of times, and I know we've seen examples of other things, but you know, when I sort of talk about the otherness of public art, when public art, I think sometimes is the most effective. It's when it serves no other purpose other than to be its thing, right? It's to be what it is, and not to do something else. Because we're surrounded in the built environment with everything that has a function: roads, sidewalks, signs, buildings. You know, all these things have a function, and sometimes when you run across something that has no other function, it allows that thing to become its own thing. It's not a part of the infrastructure of your own life about how you get from point A to point B or find your way around or a place to work or a place to live in or whatever it is. It is simply there to give you this point of actually detachment, you know. That a really effective public art project lets you decouple from the functionality, from the sort of ordinary things that make up our lives and sort of populate our world, and give us this point to detach, to sort of disconnect for a moment, to look at this thing, to sort of reflect back, and it's an important way to live.
Yeah. It's also important now with some of these images we're showing you, you can't imagine these places without that artwork. Like this example here. Another example that kind of came to us too, in this idea that people realize the importance of public art, even though it's not necessarily on the tip of their tongue all the time. You and I, one of our building mechanics, came up to us and showed us this picture. He was just in western North Dakota, in the middle of nowhere, and he saw this, and that's him standing there, so you get a little sense of scale. But he just went out there and saw these pheasants, and apparently this is one of like a dozen artworks along this enchanted highway that some artist decided it would be a good idea just to put art out there and give people a reason to come to western North Dakota, because the towns were in decline, and he thought this would be a good thing. And so it has, in fact, I don't have any figures or anything, but it has, in fact, the areas has, in fact, benefited from it. You can kind of see up in the upper right-hand corner for scale. You know, the beauty of Google Earth and Google Maps now is you can go visit these things in a different way and get a real sense of scale, and that they actually cast a shadow on the earth. And we talk a lot about that as a way, like for students, that, you know, are you doing something? Because in the traditional academic model, you know, you're working in your studio and you're getting out there, but this is something that casts a shadow on the plains of the country. Other examples of things that have no other function other than to exist.
And I think about the sort of the audacity of things too. When we're talking about that sort of notion of the otherness. You know, this is just a crazy thing, isn't it? You know, it's canoes and boats all clustered together like some kind of gigantic flower, you know. And it's just, you know, I mean, that completely messes with your head for a moment, doesn't it? You know, to think about that, you know, even how it comes to be, why it's there, you know, all of that serves to, at least for me, it tends to kind of reboot me for a moment, you know, recalibrate.
And so with all that in the backdrop, we work, neither of us live in Cedar Falls where you and I is, but we both are heavily involved in the community, especially the Public Art Committee that was formed about 20 years ago.
Right.
And it was with this idea that they wanted to put public art, revitalize the Main Street. And it was one of the first public art programs of a city of about 40,000 in the state. And over the years, it's grown to be such a part of the community that they actually fund it. The city actually funds it. We get 2.5% of the hotel motel receipts. Or a percentage over percentage. Anyway, it ends up being about $15,000 to $20,000 a year to fund and maintain these artworks and do projects. So here's an example of art existing in context on Main Street with Artapalooza, which is an art festival.
And Main Street in Cedar Falls, you know, around late 1980s, early 90s was in pretty terrible state. Most of the empty storefronts, you know, and it was pretty sad. So we started doing then even just sort of temporary shows. I had sculpture students, and we would put out an RFQ and so forth. People that had some at least human scaled works we would have a temporary exhibit along this otherwise kind of vacant Main Street, and it became at least a component of economic redevelopment. And now that same 4 blocks is a tourist destination. People just love that part of the community. It's full of kind of boutique shops and restaurants and clubs and things, and it's very nice. It's like a regional little cultural, you know, mecca in a sense. It's like a nightlife place. It's, you know, and it's the public art that we put there now. Most of it's permanent, and anyway.
Well, and it grows beyond that too, because people around the state have noticed that, and this is an example of Webster City. It's a town of about 8,000 in north central Iowa, and they wanted to do public art because they see what it does and they benefit. So they put on these temporary shows, which is a lot of ways these towns get into it. They put on temporary outdoor sculpture exhibitions where they lease a sculpture from an artist for about a year and they give them a stipend, usually around $1,500, and it's in public. And a lot of times they hold events around these things and it grows. So like here's Main Street, Cedar Falls again. And I didn't even know there were stock photos of it, but apparently there are. But you can see the artwork just sort of existing and becoming these landmarks.
Yeah.
And it gives people reasons to kind of to meet and gather and you know, question what is this thing, rather than just kind of keeping their head down.
The temporary exhibitions actually became a lot of communities have benefited from this. They'll, you know, it does a couple of things. It's a low commitment way for a community, low cost, kind of low cultural commitment to bring work in, and it's a way of kind of educating the public. People start to kind of develop a sensibility about what it is that they respond to, what things resonate with that community, what things don't, you know, and how, and then they start to develop a critical framework for themselves. It also then becomes a vehicle for the creative community, their artists, to start to put their work out into the world. You know, how do you contribute to the community you live in?
And so that kind of moves us into the Public Art Incubator, which is a program that we started, but it was something that Tom had done for a long time by hiring students to help him build his own public commissions in his own studio. But we have a pretty nice facility at a 12,000, I mean, it's nice for any size university, but it's about 12,000 students, mostly from Iowa. And we saw an opportunity because we had had some good student success over the years where they would make these bigger sculptures and get them out because, you know, we have the equipment and Tom and I have different sets of skills, but we also work really well together to figure out how to build things. And we also noticed that there was kind of a gap in the generations of students of just knowing how to inherently build things. And so that was a component, and so we thought, well, why don't we try and do a project, you know, the sculpture studio sits vacant all summer, so let's try and use it over the summer, so.
That also, there was this report generated, I think in 2010, it's basically surveying graduates of art programs nationally, and students, to summarize it, the students felt like they learned a lot about art, didn't really learn a lot about what was going to happen after that, and how do they get their work into the world? How do they, think about it as a business? How do they survive? And so we sort of dovetailed the product of that report into just experiences that I had and students that had worked for me, and they were talking about how influential that had been. The years had go by, and they keep telling me, boy, how important that was that they worked for me. To me, it was just a symbiotic relationship. They needed money, I needed help, but to them it was more than that.
And so we moved, everybody can recognize this image pretty much. It's the Art Academy. Even going further, when we show these images to students, they're kind of sort of dumbfounded by it. They're like, you're just one person painting a still life in a classroom. Where are you going to go with this? So anyway, we got like 5 minutes left, so we're going to kind of fly through some of these.
Yeah.
But we started our first project unofficially was in a roundabout way. I did my graduate work at University of Nebraska. I know we're in Iowa, but the first National Special Olympics Games were held there, and through connections, I kind of got able to apply for this project, and through that, Tom and I collaborated with a student to design and fabricate this. You can see there's Beth, and build the thing. We got to work with a pyrotechnician, which is something I never thought I'd say. They like to blow things up, literally. So here it is. This might be kind of hard to see, but that's 16,000 people looking at it, and it's a very integral part of this whole ceremony in all 50 states. So at this moment, I felt like it was important that we're getting stuff out in the world. And then moving back closer to home and how do we involve students, Chicago artist Lynn Besa was a finalist for a project on UNI's campus at the now defunct Public Art Percent for Art program. But building a new dorm, she came to campus, and she's traditionally more of a mosaic, two-dimensional artist, and she had this idea for these sculptures. And so part of her pitch was that she would build it on UNI's campus. And so we hired, 5 or 6 students?
Right.
They worked directly along with Lynn, Tom, and I. They got to wear hard hats, things like that, They had fun, even though it's, it's work, and they're getting paid. But you find that they quickly separated themselves from being students and quickly became kind of artists and contractors in their own way, because they realized that time means something. It's different than academic time. We got 8 hours, this thing has a deadline, and we need to, make good on the deadline.
Yeah.
So through that, we've delved into other projects. A lot of these projects just kind of happen to, I don't want to say fall in our lap, but they sort of materialize just out of conversations and meeting people. Like, neither of us are really good at attending conferences, but when we do, we end up getting with a project somehow.
Yeah.
But this is in Nassau, Bahamas, and this was an artist that was in town doing a show at the Waterloo Center for the Arts. Through that, our student Sarah right there got to do a residency down in the Bahamas, which we wish we were doing that. But
We really screwed that up.
yeah, they liked the first cauldron so much, they want us to build another one, so we did that. But these projects here are a little different for students because you're not making necessarily art in a traditional sense, but you are making something that's going to last. And these torches are, kind of an ephemeral part of the ceremony, but then they last forever. And you're working with all these disparate, different people. We've also done several projects for Iowa State, where we had
the universities have been really good customers
so like Nori Sato came in from Seattle, worked directly with artists, or the students.
for the College of Engineering building at Ames.
And so they got to write sky lifts and install these works, and they start to take ownership of these. Sometimes they get to, we do, like, this is our first refabrication job, so these are iconic sculptures at Iowa State's campus. It's like their first public art project, and they were in decay, and so they needed to rebuild them, so they came to us, and we rebuilt them over the course of a summer.
So we form a contractual relationship with the artist, and
Yeah, Tim's a very nice guy.
yeah.
And there's Jacob. That's his favorite tool, by the way.
It's the only one he knows how to use.
Yeah, so these students are kind of finding themselves into doing these things, and they get involved from start to finish in the fabrication. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
And they get to be part of things they never thought they would be, and it's not a simulation, it's a real world thing.
We're doing this
For the Iowa Pharmacy College?
Yeah, so this is these artists, Gail Simpson and Eris Georgiadis are from Madison, so we love the fact that these Big Ten schools come to us to actually do it. This is a large project for that. I wanted to show you, we've done work with middle school kids that have designed things in their classrooms. They design sculptures in cardboard and so forth for their communities. They present them to their own city councils. Whatever gets selected, then we build for them. And then the
It
student,
gets permanently installed.
Yeah.
You can come back later and point at that and say that I
yeah,
built that.
these are these two little kids, and that's the art teacher who designed this thing. We fabricated it for them. Current students have done really well. They've done a lot of things. This is Abby. She just did a $10,000 commission for the city of Dubuque. So these students have, this is all undergraduates, so they have to learn how to, handle themselves professionally, present things to groups of people, and do all these things, which otherwise, without this as a context, you would have to do it as some sort of simulation at the university or something. So all these things become real, and they get to do these projects. So these are all students. The other thing about it, kind of going back to some of the things we talked about this morning too, one of the things that I find kind of interesting is that we have, these women, and a lot of times the women students don't seem to, it never occurred to them that they could do this, and the guys go, oh, well, yeah, I could do that, being guys, but then, you tell these women that they can do this, and then they go off and do it, and the transformation that occurs in these women is amazing. The things that they find that they can go out and into the world and do and accomplish is, it comes right out of this.
Like Sarah right there, as an
Yeah.
undergrad, got a $35,000 commission at Texas A&M University.
Yeah,
Went on to graduate school, still has done very well exhibiting. There's an example
yeah,
of
this
that.
is a project she did. This is an undergraduate. Yeah, she was a national call,
She
other
has a
things.
piece over in Coralville too,
Right.
um,
Yeah,
Vicky Reed.
yeah.
So
So
they-
these are all students' works students that had worked either with, through, for the incubator at different points, but then you can kind of see what seems to happen then from that experience.
And even when they work on specific projects, like when we're building something in the incubator, it's not like they initially copy that work. They still go out and make their own work,
Right.
which is something that, like, for example, Beth here, who's like, she didn't even go to graduate school, just went out and been an artist and has done wildly successful with public commissions. This is the John Wayne Airport in Orange County,
California. yeah.
California. Yeah. So
Big, big project, big budget. She was like 24. It's like,
So, I mean,
it's like, how'd that happen?
and then we'll get to our last couple slides here. We're almost done.
Okay.
But, some
High
of these
speed.
students, they come back, and they work with our resources, but it's interesting how this builds a little network, because these students, not only do they go off and try and be artists, but if they go off and teach, or if they go off and just live in a community, it turns out they want to contribute to this, and they start designing or building momentum to build public art programs in their community as ways of contributing to that. You can keep clicking through these, it'll build up here. So these
Okay.
are just places we've got artwork, or students have put artwork, or alumni. So I mean, by the end, it looks like we've got a pretty good spread of stuff that's happened. This is over 7 years, and a college of 12,000, we're pretty proud of that. So anyway,
Stuff like that.
stuff like that. We have a Facebook.
Yeah, see us on Facebook. If you type in Public Art Incubator, you'll find it.
Is anybody need water?
Cool. Now we're moving on to the Q&A session with our panelists. So I'm gonna ask these guys a few questions, but leave a little bit of time in case there are questions from the audience. And I had the opportunity to talk to this group prior to today, and I think that the arrangement of people that we have here and the backgrounds that they have is really interesting in terms of the way that this whole session was framed and titled, and the title of this whole session was Art Doesn't Happen Here. I didn't choose that, and so I didn't quite know what to make of it, but I had my own ideas. I have learned about what maybe inspired that title, but of course my first reaction was that that's maybe tongue-in-cheek, and maybe this group, that's probably how you feel, like of course art happens here, happens everywhere. But then I thought maybe there are these vacuums where art isn't happening, or maybe that's just a way that people feel, like if they have this kind of defeatist attitude, like we're in a small town, art doesn't happen here, so therefore let's not make the effort to do that. So I want to ask this group here, how do you feel about the sense of place and this